Immediate Better Knits here today to talk to you about the top 5 skills you need to master if you want to knit faster. I'm not talking about physically knitting faster, making your knits and purls more quickly. There are other videos out there for that. I am talking about skills you need to master so that you can knit more efficiently, your projects can go more smoothly, and you can finish your projects more quickly. So let's jump right in. Number 1, cabling without a cable needle. If you like cable knitting, this is an absolute must. I love cable knitting, but for a long time, I would avoid cabled projects because it just took so long to slide the stitches to the cable needle, move it back and forth. It was too labor intensive for heavily cabled projects. However, when you master cabling without a cable needle, you learn to work those cable crosses much more quickly without using that cable needle, and instead by holding your stitches very quickly to one side or another in order to rearrange the stitches on your needles instead of using that third needle to do it. I do have a tutorial on how to do this, and I will include a link right here as well as in the description box down below. But if you love knitting cables, that's a definite must. Skill number 2 is reading charts. When I started knitting, I remember thinking, I am never going to bother with this. First of all, the written instructions are right there. That's just going to be so much easier. Why would anybody do this? One, because the written instructions aren't always there. You will find for very complex patterns, a lot of times with very intricate lace or cable designs, the written instructions aren't included. But more importantly, 2, because when you have lines and lines and lines of text, it's very easy to lose your place, to lose where your eye was and have to backtrack and try to figure out where you were. So if you're using a chart, you can still get lost. I'm not going to say it's impossible, but the picture is much clearer. You can see what you have to do, when you have to do it, and your mind just sees one symbol and processes that as knit 2 together or whatever, the 4-4 cable cross or whatever it might be. Not just reading charts is helpful though, but becoming familiar with chart symbols. Now, every chart is going to have a key provided, and you should always check the key. As you knit more and more and become used to looking at charts, you would notice that some symbols are kind of universal in that most designers use them to mean the same thing. So usually a rightward slanting line like this means a right-leaning decrease, and a leftward slanting line like this means a left-leaning decrease. And as you get more familiar with those symbols and you can commit them to memory, you don't have to be flipping back and forth to the chart to see what you're supposed to be doing. You can just go through that chart and knit it without having to consult anything. It's almost like reading, but you're much less likely to get lost in the pattern. It's also much easier if you are using a chart to use a piece of washi tape, or if you are a digital pattern person, to use an app like Knit Companion that will just put a line right where you are on the chart, and that way you're not going to get lost. You're just going to have the line to tell you which row of the chart you're on, so that you can move through much more speedily than if you were trying to read the written instructions for that same chart. Skill number 3 is fixing your mistakes. If you are always either tinking back or even unraveling in order to fix mistakes, that is taking up a lot of your time. And many mistakes can be fixed without having to do that. A little bit later this month here on the Immediate Better Knits YouTube channel, I am going to have a tutorial for you about one of those, which is dropping down and laddering back up. So let's say you're working on a pattern and you were supposed to purl a stitch about 4 or 5 rows ago, but you accidentally knit it. You do not have to rip out all of those rows. You simply work to where the incorrect stitch is, drop that stitch off the needle, let it unravel, fix your knit and turn it into a purl, and then ladder back up or pull the stitch back up through those 4 or 5 rows and put it back on the needle. You can also do this for miscrossed cables. It is a little bit trickier. A little bit later this year, I will have a tutorial on that over here on the YouTube channel. But learning how to fix your mistakes without unraveling your work or without taking back is really going to save you a lot of time. There are lots of tutorials out there, I'm sure, right here on YouTube about how to do this with lace patterns and with brioche and with cables, and it really is a must-have skill if you want your projects to go faster, because let's face it, we're all going to make mistakes, absolutely. But learning how to fix them is what's going to be key. Skill number 4 is going to be using stitch markers. That may sound like a pretty beginner skill. However, there are a bunch of different ways that you can use stitch markers. Somewhere along the way when I was an early knitter, I felt like stitch markers were a sign of weakness. Well, no, we all get crazy ideas. They're not. Stitch markers are fantastic for helping you make your project more efficiently. So first, a lot of times, the pattern designer will tell you where to place stitch markers, but those aren't hard and fast rules. You might find other places that you want to put your stitch markers to mark certain things. If you know a couple of stitches here or there are going to change, and you don't want to have to count, let's say there are 10 stitches before you have to do a column of purl stitches. You don't want to count every time, you can mark it off. Even if the pattern designer doesn't actually tell you to, you can use your very own knitting brain and figure out great places to put those stitch markers on your needle to mark off where increases and decreases go, where cables are crossed, where stitch patterns change, pretty much anything. And the only trouble you might have there is if your cable needle is full of stitch markers. So make sure that you use different colors or designs for different things, but they can really help keep your knitting organized. Secondly, locking stitch markers are really helpful to use. So these most often look kind of like a safety pin, but without a coil at the end, because you don't want that there. That might snag your yarn, although in a pinch, you could probably use a safety pin. And these can be inserted into your fabric itself. So let's say you are working on the body of a sweater and it says to decrease 4 stitches every 5 rows 10 times. That's a lot of counting. You're going to count, every 5 rows, and then you're going to count 10 repeats, and maybe you forget to keep track of your rows, so then you have to go back and count how many you've knit, or you have to keep track of your repeats. Then you have to go back and count how many decreases you've worked. If you put locking stitch markers in your fabric to mark your decreases, not only will you be able to see at a glance how many you have done, but it will also be a lot easier to count the rows in between if that's what you need to do. And again, that can be used for anything. Increases, decreases, maybe you have to work a cable cross every so many rows. Put those locking stitch markers in your fabric. Just saves you time with counting, especially if you are a knitter who likes to work maybe late at night in the dark at the movies when it's very hard to count, or you're just really tired and counting is kind of escaping you. Go ahead and use those locking stitch markers. Stitch markers are not for the weak. They're not a weakness. They're good for your project. And the last skill I want to suggest you master if you would like to make your knitting go faster is reading your knitting. So what does that mean? That means being able to look at what you have already knit and see where you have done what. So you should be able to identify an increase or a decrease. You should be able to identify whether it's leaning to the right or to the left. See the light. You should be able to count how many rows are between your stripes. You should be able to look at your cable crosses and see, how did I cross those in the right direction, or should have been reversed? So learning to read your knitting, and it's basically just about being able to identify stitches that are already in the fabric, is also going to be very helpful so that you can see what you've done. You can quickly identify any mistakes and then go back to that previous tip about fixing your mistakes. If you're not using stitch markers, you can count the rows between your increases or decreases, and you can count the number of repeats of a stitch pattern you've worked and things like that. So use those stitch markers, they're really helpful. But in the absence of them, there are lots of occasions where it's also going to be really helpful to be able to read your knitting and identify what you've done, to make sure that you are on track with the pattern, to make sure that you haven't skipped a decrease or skipped a repeat of something without having to actually unravel and redo something thinking that you've made a mistake. You don't want to waste time fixing mistakes that aren't there, or having to repeat something because you're just not sure how many times you've done it or that you've done it the right way. So the last one, skill number 5, learn to read your knitting. All right, those are my top 5 skills to master if you want to knit faster. As I said, a couple of tutorials will be coming up later this month and later this year here on Media Beruana Knits, addressing some of those skills, and a couple of tutorials are already linked down below in the description box for a couple of those skills as well. That's all I've got for you this time.